This is Antic, the Atari ST podcast.
This is an interview episode of Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast. I'm Kevin Savitz. Gary Yost worked at Antic magazine in product development. He was the man behind The Catalog, Antic's catalog of third-party software. When Atari Program Exchange was shut down, he contacted programmers from APX to republish their works in Antic's catalog. Gary was instrumental in creating CAD 3D, written by Tom Hudson, Cybermate, and the Cyber Studio Graphics Suite, which were all published by Antic, and in commercializing the StereoTek 3D glasses, which provided a 3D view of the Atari ST's screen. After Antic, he went on to form the Yost Group, which created and licensed a number of products to Autodesk, including Autodesk Animator, Autodesk 3D Studio, and Autodesk 3ds Max. This interview took place on May 16, 2016. In it, we discuss Ted Kahn, Jim Capparell, and Tom Hudson, all of whom I have previously interviewed. Talk to me about the story before the story, how you got interested in computers, and kind of the run-up to how you ended up at Antic.
You realize this is 30 plus years ago.
Yes.
You're expecting a lot of my memory today.
I get that answer a lot, a whole lot.
I'm sure you do.
Do your best.
I might as well just make all this stuff up. It's almost like it never happened at all, but I'll do my best.
It did happen. You were attempting a career as a commercial photographer, and that wasn't working out, and so you got obsessed with computers.
How do you know that?
I did research.
Okay.
So, I mean, if you're going to lie, at least be consistent with the previous lies you told.
Okay, thanks for reminding me so I can be consistent there. So, yeah, you're actually right. I was not only attempting a career as a photographer, but I was trying to become a videographer as well. And I just recently, I guess 1982, got my FCC first class radio telegraph operator's license and was trying to get a job as part of an ENG crew here in San Francisco. Because my passion had gone back to pre-high school, middle school days when I was making little 8mm movies and really thought I wanted to be a photographer or a filmmaker when I grew up. So I was having a really hard time getting a job in the video business in San Francisco because it was a union business at that time. If you weren't in the union, that chance getting a job. So, I don't know, the Timex Sinclair started shipping and I started playing around with it and making, little cursor shapes move around on the screen. And, I don't know, was that 1981 maybe? 80 or 81, and taught myself BASIC. And then I got involved with the Atari Institute for Educational Action Research in 1982 to study how people who are homebound could use computers to telecommute, actually.
How did you get hooked up with them? Were you working with Ted over there, or what?
Oh, you know Ted Kahn?
I've interviewed him, yeah.
Girl, I'd like to hear that interview, actually. I was in the middle of an illness myself, and so I started to see how people who were in that position could take advantage of these new computers, and there were these incredibly fast 300 baud dial-up modems, and I thought, wow, there's some potential here, and so I wrote a letter, and Ted responded, and thought what I was doing was interesting, and I got involved in testing the Controlled Data Corporation Plato terminal. He might have spoken about that in your interview, but it was a pretty radical thing. It was a bitmap addressable graphics telecommunication program that ran on a little cartridge that plugged into the Atari 800 and Atari 400, and it emulated a CDC Plato terminal, which is a fairly high resolution black and white bitmap display that you could do graphics on, and it used the joystick as a cursor, and if you press the button on the joystick, you'd zoom in to the screen, because of course the Atari screen was pretty low resolution. It was about a quarter the Plato terminal screen, and so that was a really interesting project. And at one point, I asked, it wasn't Ted, I forget who it was at Atari, if they could introduce me to anyone in San Francisco who's doing anything interesting with the Atari 800. And they introduced me to Jim Capparell, who is the publisher of Antic.
Sure.
Antic hadn't published too many issues at that time. It was 1982. Do you know when Antic started publishing?
I can find out very easily. The first issue was April 1982.
Right, so this was the end of 82, and there were a few issues out, and it was fascinating to me that there was a magazine about this computer. And I went down to Jim's house. They were publishing the magazine out of his house at the time in Potrero Hill. And I introduced myself, and we hit it off, and I started hanging around and helping sell ad space originally, because it was a way to make some money. I mean, that was where the money was in the magazine, selling ads.
Sure.
And I'm trying to remember when, I think it was the end of 83, we were talking with some people using Atari 800s and a program called Movie Maker. Do you remember that?
Vaguely, yes.
Here it says International Picture Systems.
Look at the Atari Mania link. It'll look familiar. Reston Publishing. Yeah, Interactive Picture Systems, published by Reston. Yeah,
that's it. And there was a art school in Philadelphia. Let me Google art schools in Philadelphia. And they were using this program. It wasn't the Art Institute, it wasn't CCA. I forget which one. Maybe it was, I don't know. I don't remember which art school, but there was an art school in Philadelphia using Movie Maker, and there was a guy in that department who was the brother of an actor named Guy Nuri. I think it was Michael. Maybe it was the brother. Maybe the actor was named Michael Nuri, and the artist was Guy. Michael. Yeah, the actor is Michael Nuri, and he was in Flashdance. And his brother Guy, spelled Guy. Mm-hmm. He was an artist and was playing around with Movie Maker. And I was just talking to him because, as you know, my job, I would just call everyone in the Atari ecosystem. That's what I did all the time.
Were you basically just cold calling? Just, hey, we have a magazine, buy an ad?
We were doing a combination of that and calling existing advertisers to see if they wanted to buy another ad. Mm-hmm. It was one of those two things. So I would just call everyone to make contacts. And so I kind of knew everyone at that time. And Guy sent me some stuff they had done in Movie Maker, which was pretty exciting to me because it was the closest thing to a film I'd seen kind of done yet, you know. And of course, in my mind, I was always thinking, I want to make movies, I want to make movies, I want to make movies. And so I contracted with him to develop an interactive Christmas card that Antic could send out to their advertisers on a 5 1/4-inch floppy that Christmas of 1983.
Fun.
And boy, I wish I had a video of that card. But of course, it was super crude, but not at the time. You know, it was interesting at the time, and cute, and had a little humor in it, and was so fun. I thought, oh, you know, this is great. I want to do I want to do more of this kind of stuff. And I worked with people using Movie Maker in 1984, but then got really sidetracked in 1984 when we launched the catalog, which I'm sure you know all about that. And so the way that started, I don't know if you know the origin story for the catalog, but Jack Tramiel bought Atari in
84.
Or maybe the very end of 83 or the beginning of 84. And at that time, one of their initial moves was to discontinue the Atari Connection.
Atari Program Exchange.
Yeah, the Atari Program Exchange, sorry. Atari Connection was a magazine.
Right.
So the idea was that it was just costing them too much money to manage the program exchange. Apex, right? And they let it go. But I knew so many people down there that I asked if I could get a contact list for all of the programmers who contributed to Apex, and I got one. And I just started calling them up, and I asked one of them to send me his Apex contract, and I looked at it and looked at the terms and produced a new contract with essentially the same terms, but for Antic. And we sent a letter out, I think, to every one of those programmers, and quite a few responded. And we had disk duplicating equipment at Antic because there was a floppy that you could buy that was associated with different issues. And so it was not a big deal to ramp up, and we just thought we'd sell a few discs from the Apex catalog here and there. But a bunch of people signed on, and the one that was the most interesting initially was a C compiler called Deep Blue Sea.
Right, by John Palovich.
By John Palovich, that's right. And it was, I think, the only C compiler for the Atari, and was super popular right off the bat. I mean, I don't know what month we shipped the first catalog in, but orders started pouring in, and since I didn't know anything about software publishing, I hadn't really established any sort of customer service. And I think there was a big run of misduplicated discs right in that first month. So they were being sent out, and there were maybe bad sectors or something on them. I don't really remember what it was. But the phone started ringing, and people started having problems, and we had to hire people right away to handle those calls. And it was, a learning by doing introduction to software publishing. And became, fairly popular in a little way, and we started picking up new 8-bit programs that hadn't been in the Atari Program Exchange. Mm-hmm. And then it was not too long after that the Atari ST came out. I don't know, when was that? The end of 84 or the beginning of 85?
Early 85, I believe. It was after the Mac.
Yeah, that's right. Early 85. And so we started thinking, 8-bit, 16-bit, let's move over to the ST, add some things there. And I started looking around, and the first person, of course, I'm still thinking about graphics and making movies the whole time. I'm just focused. I just want to make movies with these cheap computers so I don't have to get a job at a film studio or whatever. And Tom Hudson he had written some really interesting things for analog. He wrote a little 3D thing called Solid States, which was kind of fascinating. And then he was working on Degas for Batteries Included. And he had already signed a publishing deal with Michael Reichman at BI. Tom had said that he would talk to me about publishing his next program. and he was thinking about taking solid states and porting it over to the Atari ST. And I said that could be very interesting. And that was probably the third quarter of 85. Right after Degas started shipping, Tom started thinking what he was going to do next. And I'm sure you've spoken to Tom already, and he's given you his side of this whole story. But we went to Comdex in those days, which was happening twice a year. I think it was like November in Vegas and January somewhere else, usually Atlanta, I think. So Antic usually showed something in the Atari booth at Comdex, and I was there, and Tom flew in for that. And while we were there in the West Hall of the LA Convention Center, I found out that Apple was showing Macintosh software in the main hall. And on the first day of the show, Tom and I walked over to the Apple booth, and we got a demo of something called Easy 3D. And who published Easy 3D? I think it was published out of Chicago. Yeah, it's not easy to find Easy 3D because there's a lot of Google hits on those words.
Right.
But it was a bit of a revelation because, we saw the Mac GUI basically sitting on top of something that was a lot like solid states. And we were actually showing the ST version of solid states over there in the West Hall. But when we came back from seeing, what could be done when you wrapped a GUI around all that math, we were both super excited about it. And Tom left Vegas to go home, and very quickly, in the matter of just a couple weeks, he had used, the GEM operating system to wrap a similar kind of a front end around solid states. And we started talking about, this could really turn into something, and, refine that into what's, became CAD 3D. And once that came out, which must have been, 86.
I think that's about right.
It's probably spring of 86. Tom started to talk about how he felt that it was possible to write a simple application programming interface for CAD 3D for the next version. We already started talking about the next version. I think CAD 3D was $29.95, and we were talking about maybe coming out with something that was $49.95 that had an API in it. And so he started coming out with CAD 3D 2.0, and around the same time he started working on that, I got a call from a really amazing guy who worked up at Tektronix in Beaverton named Mark Kimball. And he said that he had something to show me running with CAD 3D, but I needed to come up to Oregon to see it. And so I, flew up to Portland, drove out to Beaverton, went into the Tektronix research lab, and he put a pair of goggles on me that had these liquid crystal shutters, and they had written a way of capturing frames from CAD 3D and saving them to, initially it was just static frames, but they also had a non-compressed kind of an image stream where they were capturing right eye and left eye views. and they put these goggles on me. They look like welder goggles. They were actually refactored welder's goggles with these liquid crystal shutters, and showed me a little animation of a spinning hedron of some kind, and it was almost a religious experience. It was pretty incredible. These glasses, they were 15 hertz per eye, so you had to use them in a really dark room. But it was just so exciting. And they sent me back to San Francisco with a pair of those glasses and that utility. And I think I spent the next 3 or 4 days barely sleeping and just making little animations. And I got them to send a set to Tom. And Tom and Mark started talking together. And they started talking about, what might be possible to do with this new application programming interface that Tom was working on. And they thought, maybe they could hook this thing in so you could semi-automate this process of making these animations, which they did. And Mark actually came up with a very early version of, what you would now call QuickTime, and that he had, it was a delta compression technique where there were basically, complete frames stored every n frames, and then the changes in between those frames, and then you get a complete frame again. And this is way before QuickTime. And I'm not sure if he's the first person who ever did this. I kind of think maybe some of this technology came out of University of Utah and Dr. Sutherland's lab, but it was there was nothing like it on a commercially available platform. And so Mark had a tool that would do this automatically. Tom started working on ways to do very simple keyframing with a scripting language. He also started working on a very kind of a crude anti-aliasing plugin. So we had kind of a scripting language and an anti-aliasing plugin and these 3D glasses. And it was kind of a little bit of an ecosystem of 3D tools. And we started talking to Daryl Anderson, who was one of our artists, but also had a very engineering background. And he started playing around with these things. And I think Mark started writing an animation creation language in Forth, which nobody knew Forth. It was a very obscure language, and it was pure reverse Polish notation and a little unwieldy for anyone who was used to BASIC or Pascal or C. But we ended up bundling this thing we called, I think, Cybermate, Cyber Control. I don't know, Cybermate, that was the language. And then I started talking to the people at Sony because I had met some of them, and they gave me a bunch of their hardware that used this Control L interface to start and stop their recorders. And they had a lot of these 8mm standard definition recorders in an interesting little product line that were kind of semi-pro oriented. And Tom wrote a little program that would automatically edit to that recorder. So we now have like a whole lot going on.
Mm-hmm.
Mark and Tom were just cranking out interesting code. And I was kind of packaging it and working with Daryl Anderson on demoing it, development testing and demoing. And I really started not to care much about anything else because my dreams of making movies in the computer started to become a reality. And I guess the short story is, across the street from Antic, there was a small group of people interested in 3D graphics led by a man named Harold Hadelman, and it was called Suite 3D for Computer Graphics. And it was literally across the street from our office. And he invited me over there one day, and they were running this package called Lumina from a company named Time Arts. It was also published by AT&T, believe it or not, under the name Crystal 3D, I think. AT&T made this Vista card for the IBM PC, which was a 24-bit frame buffer for the PC. And once I saw that you could do production level 3D animation on an IBM, I went back and talked to Tom about it. And I think he visited and we went out there together and we would just sit in front of this Time Arts Illumina workstation. And, we were both saying, we can do this. This is not challenging at all. I think that was like a $10,000 piece of software. And at the same time, we had this ecosystem around the Atari stuff. And we were coming on to Comdex 1987 by this time, and we had built a big black plywood shroud for the ST's 4-bit monitor. Is that 4-bit monitor?
You're right. Yeah.
16-color monitor. We built a big plywood shroud so you could get your head in there with those 3D glasses. And even in the bright lights of the Las Vegas Convention Center, you could get a really good experience.
Because you wanted to keep it dark enough.
Without flick. So I remember John Lovelace, who worked at Antic at the time, built this big shroud in his garage. And I don't know how we got it to Las Vegas. It was heavy. Someone must have driven there. And the Autodesk people came over and were just extremely interested in what we were doing with this whole ecosystem of stuff. And it wasn't the first time Autodesk got interested in what we were doing. They had actually offered Tom a job at the previous Comdex after he showed the CAD 3D 2.0. And Tom said he wasn't interested in the job. He wanted to work for himself. But by the time we showed them this huge ecosystem of 3D stuff, at that point, right after that Comdex, they contacted me and they said, we're not offering you a job, but we'd like to talk about, a licensing agreement where, you and Tom and whoever else, you think you can find to flesh this thing out, get together and build what's essentially the AutoCAD for 3D. And I mean, they were coming to a couple of guys, from nowhere.
Right.
But they were impressed enough where they thought we had a lot of potential. And they knew some things we didn't know. They knew that IBM was about to launch the VGA card, and that would change everything for IBM graphics. It would go to 8-bit, and it was a radical. It was like an inflection point in that business. So. That's pretty much the arc of how I got interested in Atari software and how I went through the Atari period and ended up on the other side. And this is all documented pretty well on a website Martin Duderoff put together. What's the name of it? I think it's on his site. It is called the Antic Cybergraphics Software. It's at duderoff.com.
Right. Yeah, I remember I corresponded with him like a decade ago when he was setting up that site. And because I had some copies of the catalog that he didn't have and sent them to him. And
he'd be a great interview. Funny story about him. So soon after we started shipping Cyber Studio, which was this aggregate of all these little tools, I got a videotape in the mail, VHS tape, of a bunch of 3D like logos and fun little things that Martin Duderoff did with one of his buddies, and mostly using pieces from our 3D clip art that we published. Another aspect of this 3D collection of stuff was 3D clip art that Daryl Anderson made. So Martin sent me this video, and it was really fun. I think he had used a Jean-Michel Jarre song as the soundtrack, and of course, with me, I'm thinking like, somebody who sees the world the way I do wants to make movies with these things. And his phone number was on there, and I called it up, and a woman answered the phone, and I said, "Hi, is Martin there?" And she said, "No, actually, he's at school." And I said, "Oh, can you give me his number? He's at college. Give me his phone number there." She's like, "No, he was in like 8th grade. He'll be home at 3:00. And I started working with Martin and his buddies, and they were beta testers. They were our first beta testers, and then that established a very long-standing relationship with Martin, on and off for, I don't know, 15 years probably. He's such a great guy, big supporter, and a brilliant person as well. And there were other people involved. I mean, Maurice Molyneux was a great artist who also did some programming. And then in the middle of all this, Jim Kent showed up. So the way Jim Kent and Cyberpaint evolved was, I was living in the western part of San Francisco. There was a computer store out here in the avenues on Geary and 10th Avenue. And one day I walked in there, and Jim Kent was showing a little paint program he had running on the Amiga. And it was painting over time. So you can work with a sequence of frames. And, I was at Antic, and I thought, hey, this would be great on the Atari. You should come down to 2nd Street. And he did. And he ended up doing a version of that for Antic. I forget if Cyberpaint was the first one, or he might have done something even simpler first. But that evolved into it was called Cyberpaint. Yeah, I'm trying to remember more about it. But and that you were able to paint on these sequences of 3D images that CAD 3D could produce. So you could start combining 2D graphics with 3D graphics. And, that was pretty amazing. Of course, you could also use it to touch up Z-buffer rendering errors and all sorts of, problems. But so it was like a very poor man's Quantel paint box kind of a thing, and a very important part of the ecosystem. And then Jim Kent went on to work with us on the Autodesk side to do a version of that, Autodesk Animator, for us in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And then he retired from graphic software development, and he went on to become very famous as a bioinformatics pioneer. He was one of the people at University of California, Santa Cruz, who mapped the genome before the commercial bioinformatics companies could do it, keeping the human genome in the public domain. So in that world, he's a superstar, and I'm sure that's been very satisfying work for him. So, but that was an important part. The 2D component was a really critical part to making all the other stuff happen. So I'm trying to think, is there anyone else part of that? Well, of course, Jack Powell was our tech writer and the resident human being in the group.
What do you mean by that?
So, this stuff started out being, mildly complicated to do just because 3D had another, dimension to it than 2D. And the nature of 3D is you have to kind of wrap your head around it. Then over time, with all these different tools with Cyber Studio and then, the Autodesk products, they become more and more and more complicated. And we used to joke about how you had to kind of mutate along with the software in order to maintain a a high level of facility with essentially building worlds inside of the computer, which is really what we were aiming at, full-blown cinematographic simulations. And so Jack was an actor by trade and very literate, well-read, and could write very clearly. And so back in the Antic days, he started writing the catalog copy with me. We would work on it together. And then he started writing the documentation for the more complicated catalog products that needed it. And we actually had printed documentation for quite a while. We had nice little manuals and things, which was unusual then for that price software. So Jack was a really, really important member of the team, kind of representing the user, someone who wasn't super familiar with all of these terms and techniques. So it was a nice little team. And of course, Jack came over with us to the Autodesk side when we jumped ship from the Motorola chips to the Intel chips. And he was also, just such a valuable member of the team. So other things that happened at the catalog days that related to 3D were, I'm trying to remember. I'm sure you could look up one of your catalogs, but there was a 3D molecular modeling package. Scott Legrand, I think, was the author of that. And that was a very interesting use of the 3D glasses as well. And you could output those 3D molecular models as a 3D database, which you could then load into CAD 3D. So you could build 3D models in that molecular modeler and then bring them into CAD 3D and then do animations with them in stereoscopic. So, it was really rich. We even had some games that worked with the 3D glasses, and they were not bad. They were pretty good. And I think I went on 4 or 5 different speaking tours at stereoscopic conferences, because stereo was pretty big in the scientific and military markets at the time, and they would ask me to come and speak as kind of like the comic relief with the guy with the $100 15 hertz glasses on the Atari, because they were all working with Evans and Sutherland workstations and very expensive workstations. And I would show up with my Atari ST and my little glasses and kind of blow them away. They were pretty amazed. I would always be talking with Lenny. I'm trying to remember his name. Lenny Lipton. Lenny Lipton was a very he was a prominent innovator in the field of stereoscopic filmmaking. Interestingly, he also wrote the song Puff the Magic Dragon.
There's a claim to fame.
Yeah.
Nice.
Fascinating person. And it was very fun to go out on these things like Boston, Washington, Seattle, and talk at these conferences. Following up Lenny. It was a lot of fun. I'm gonna have to look him up. Actually, I haven't thought about him in a long time. So I really stopped caring about anything besides 3D graphics, which would eventually lead towards filmmaking. Once probably after early 1986, and started to just totally lose interest in the catalog. Outside of all that stuff, and
so during all this, you're still publishing the catalog and working on that simultaneous to all the graphic stuff.
Yeah, yeah, it was a lot of work. I mean, you probably have some issues of the catalog there. They got pretty involved in the last few. You know, they're thick 4-color, you know, chock full of things that you could buy.
Yeah, and they were thick, and for a while it was 8-bit stuff and ST stuff, and then of course the 8-bit stuff started to fade away, and it was more and more ST stuff. But yeah, there was a lot going on in that catalog. Was that was it a big money maker for Antic? In a time, I assume in a time of later years, and a time of dwindling ad sales, it might have been an important part of the business.
Yeah, I don't really remember what kind of revenues we were making. It was big enough moneymaker that that Jim Capparell allowed me to continue. So it had to be in the black, and and I know that he wanted me to expand that side of the business some more, and I was just really resistant to that because the writing on my wall was all about just focusing on the graphic software. And you know, Tom was willing to, you know, move with me from the Atari to the PC platform, and it's you know, once I found out about the VGA display, it was all over. You know, it was great. I mean, we were really lucky with the timing.
Right.
And I mean, then there's of course a whole other story once we got over to Autodesk. Mm-hmm. That's actually a much bigger story. Many more moving parts, lots more people involved.
Sure.
And it went on for a much longer time. That we started with Autodesk in 1988, and then we were out of it by 1998. So that's about a 10-year story.
Nice.
Good story. And now I'm doing what I always wanted to do, which is just make movies. That's what I do.
Tell me about that. You were doing something with Tibet. I looked at your website, and what are you working on now?
No, that was a color grading project I did about Bhutan. I did a project with a local filmmaker about Bhutan. Actually, I did a series of films in Fiji last year for a nonprofit over there. But I am peripatetic. I am the peripatetic short filmmaker. I am all over the place. I don't like to do the same thing more than once or twice. And I've had a lot of great opportunities to work with creative people here in the Bay Area. And because I have a great understanding of how software works, and I have a natural inclination to understand hardware as well, it's really easy for me to put together teams of people and teams of tools, you know, large groups of tools, and use them in interesting ways. You know, my website, which is just my name, has just a whole lot of stuff on it, and it's actually all pretty interesting stuff. And I'm just having like the greatest time in the world. I mean, I first wanted to be a filmmaker when I was probably about 10, 11 years old. And my buddies and I, back in high school, would sit around and, you know, smoke pot and dream about one day we were going to have the tools to make films in our bedrooms. And we coined the term Surreally Studios for this virtual studio where you could sit at home and you could make movies as good as, you know, what Hollywood can do. And that goes back, you know, that's 1974, 1975. We were having those pipe dreams, literally.
It took a few years, but it totally happened.
It happened. So, I mean, now, I mean, I have incredible tools. I mean, I shoot 4K RAW from drones, from cinema cameras. I have a DaVinci Resolve color editing suite in my little cabin out back, and I've never been happier, and I feel like I'm finally doing the thing I really, really wanted to do, when I grow up. And, so lucky to have made it to this place. And the software was the most important stepping stone because I didn't have the means to create a film company myself, and I wasn't a union member, and I just kind of it was the wrong timing for me. I wasn't in LA, and in San Francisco, I love it here. I didn't want to leave. It's just there were no opportunities for me. So I have tremendous gratitude to all the people along the way who have been so creative and helped make all this possible. I mean, especially people like Tom and Jack, and then on the Autodesk side, there's so many, Dan Silva and Don Britton and Rolf Berteig, and then there's Martin Duderoff and Gus Gruba, and there's so many people. But of course, also really, really grateful to all of our people who've used the software and really loved it. I mean, we wouldn't have gone anywhere if people didn't actually use it and appreciate it. And we got a good response to CAD 3D 2.0 right off the bat. 1.0 was a little underpowered, but when 2.0 shipped, people were really interested in it and were doing, fascinating things. So, it's funny how things happen, what a long circuitous route things can take in order to get you where you want to go. But in my case, I've been very fortunate.
Excellent. I would like to go way back to the beginning to ask a follow-up question to something you said 40 minutes ago. I was looking at Martin Duderoff's site here. It says you got involved through a grant for the Atari Institute. The grant supported an experiment to determine if homebound individuals recuperating from an illness could financially support themselves with consumer computing hardware. I'm wondering, do you remember what was the result of that experiment?
God, I wish I knew. I think they basically killed it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was hard working with controlled data. They owned a lot of intellectual property. And I don't believe the Plato terminal cartridge ever shipped as a commercial product. It did.
Yeah.
Then it was for a short period of time then before the Trammels bought Atari. And I was hoping that the Trammels would revive it for the ST because, the monochrome ST display was so beautiful, and it would have you wouldn't have had to zoom into it to use it on the on the Plato network, but they never did. So I think it just kind of died a slow and quiet death. That project inspired in me the knowledge that people could work remotely from their homes. And so when we started the Yost group in 1988, it was developed, purely as a, remote, home-based virtual work group. And all of us were in different locations. Eventually, in 1993, when the phone system started making ISDN available, it became a real thing. And we were one of the first virtual work, software development groups that was, had that very, very high level of productivity. On the Autodesk side, there were really only like 6 of us doing the work of, our nearest competitor was Alias, and they had at least 10 times that number of people in the Alias development group. And I attribute that to a lot of the initial research I'd done at the Atari Institute as to how all this could happen, how you could set up a virtual work group. So that work back in 1983, 1984 ended up paying huge dividends 10 years later.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. Another thing I noticed, I'm sorry, I know all of your massive great work was in the ST stuff, and I keep asking you about 8-bit stuff, but I'm an 8-bit guy. So when you guys started taking over the Apex stuff, you distributed the documentation on the back of the disk using a viewer instead of the printed documentation that Apex did.
Yeah, that's right. We had no budget for printed material, and And we did. How did we do that? Those are two-sided discs, huh?
Yes. Most of them were two-sided discs, and there was you could either view it on the screen or you could print it from the same viewer. But I assumed it was a cost-saving measure, and that was kind of my question.
Yeah, there was very, very low overhead on the Apex stuff. I think the prices we were charging were pretty cheap. We didn't get into printed documentation until the Cyber Studio. I think that was our first one. Yeah. And I'm scraping the bottom of this memory hole here.
Get it. So what haven't I asked you that I should have?
Oh, I mean, those days, Antic went through a period where it was very vibrant and there was a lot going on. We had a beautiful building on South Park, which is a unique little neighborhood between 2nd and 3rd Streets and Bryant Street, and what's now right next to the ballpark in San Francisco. And at the time, you could park anywhere, and now, of course, it's hard to park anywhere. And there were really, a lot of great people at the company. It was just a really beautiful, open, well-lit space, and great sense of camaraderie, and having those monthly deadlines for the magazine were great incentive. And I have a lot of fond memories of the people there, and just the newness of the microcomputer industry. It was just really exciting. And kind of looking and seeing what was going on in the very high end while we were at the low end. I remember going to the ACM SIGGRAPH conference in San Francisco. It must have been, was that 98? No, ACM SIGGRAPH San Francisco. And that was it was just around the corner from the Antic offices. And it was a very big influencer on what was going on in my life. Is it 85? Yeah, it was 1985. That was that was when Pixar showed the Pixar image computer, and Apple had a little presence there. But I'd say that was a epiphany, going to the 1985 SIGGRAPH and seeing the Pixar image computer particularly, and all that volumetric imaging that they were doing with medical data, CT scans and things. And I just thought, wow, this is totally what I want to do when I grow up. And that was just about when CAD 3D 1.0 shipped. So I'd say that SIGGRAPH show in July of '85 was a big push towards all of that. It's funny how those things happen, huh? Yeah, I could start just making shit up. No problem.
Thought we were doing that from the beginning. Didn't we establish that with photography?
I think everything I told you is actually fairly accurate.
I think I have what I need.
Great. Yeah, take care. Have a good rest of the day.
You too. Bye. If you enjoy these interviews and would like to contribute something, I encourage you instead to donate to one of our favorite organizations, the Internet Archive, at archive.org. The Internet Archive is a nonprofit digital library with the stated mission of universal access to all knowledge. They've done incredible things to preserve computer history, including hosting thousands of programs in an in-browser Atari emulator, creating the Wayback Machine, and offering full-page scans of countless Atari computer books and magazines. Make your tax-deductible contribution at archive.org/donate.